I was 23, I met a man, and that man changed my life. With one hand and 3 words, Tanaz put his hand on my arm. He said, "Please help us." Tanaz is an indigenous elder, a medicine man. He lives on Sibrut, a remote rainforested island in Indonesia. And I was there as part of a group of tourists, experiencing what the tour guide had said to us was Sibrut's primitive culture. I loved the culture, I loved the environment, but I felt ashamed. I felt ashamed to be there as a tourist, just watching, doing nothing. Because at night, the people would tell me stories in hushed whispers, stories of how their children were dying from a mysterious disease, a disease I later found out was the measles. They told me how logging companies were illegally cutting down their rainforest. They told me how people were being forced to move to government villages, to abandon their culture, their tradition, their language. I don't know if Tanaz sensed my shame. I don't know if he saw my horror at the stories. But for whatever his reason, he chose to ask me for help. And his choice had a profound influence on the choices that I would go on to make. With one simple gesture, humanity and solidarity took on new meaning for me. I wanted to help, but I didn't have a clue how I was a young lawyer going to do anything. But when I returned back to London, I felt compelled to try. I started to research, I started to contact friends, parents of friends, friends of parents. I set up an organization called SOS Sibrut. I even recruited my boyfriend. I went and spoke to politicians, businessmen, environmental organizations, trying to persuade somebody, anybody, to care about this island and its people enough to act, to write a letter, to protest, to campaign. And meanwhile, I was working as a junior lawyer. My law firm had offered me a fast track to partnership. One afternoon, sitting in my friend's living room, I made a decision. I would go back to Indonesia to help Tanaz and his community. It wasn't enough anymore to work from afar. And that decision was terrifying. I was giving up, after all, the opportunity of a successful career and a comfortable life. But that decision felt inevitable, and it felt right. I made a choice. I went on to work with Indonesian activists fighting against injustice. I went on to work with doctors and nurses who want to alleviate the suffering of people living through some of the worst humanitarian crises of our times. I worked with students who believe in an equitable global health system, a system where everybody can get the medicines that they need, rich or poor. I saw that when we choose to act, when we choose to reach out a hand to help the other, we can make a difference. We can make change. Indonesia was the first act in my social justice awakening. Rwanda was the second. April 1994, the Rwandan genocide has begun. I'm working with Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, on the border of Congo and Rwanda. I'm there waiting for the people that we're expecting to cross, to leave the horror of what was happening in Rwanda. But none came. Every day I went to the border, hoping. And one day a young boy ran out of the border forest. He was wearing a ripped white t-shirt. His eyes were wide with fear. He took one look at me, turned on his heels, and ran back into the forest. A while later, he emerged again. His name was Shema, and behind him came his older brother, who was cradling a baby in his arms. The boy stood out in the open, looking at me. I saw that the older boy had a huge gash, as if from a machete, on the side of his head. There was dried blood caked onto his shirt, onto his skin. Shema pointed down at the baby in his brother's arms. He said, "Aidez mon frère, help my brother." The baby's leg was almost severed. Later that same day, the baby died, still cradled in his brother's arms. Later, Shema told me what had happened. He said that mobs of militia had come to his village waving machetes. He'd heard screaming and crying. He and his family had been herded out of their hut, and he watched as they murdered his father, followed by his mother, followed by his sisters. He saw his uncle among the militia. His uncle was talking rapidly with the other militia and pointing at him and his brothers. And then he came over and herded them roughly into the bush. Shema was sure that they were going to die. But instead, his uncle told them to run and to never look back. In a context where family members were killing family members, his uncle made a choice. It would be many weeks before hundreds of thousands of people flooded across the border into Congo. You see, Rwanda was like a fishbowl. You could look in and you could look out, but you could not get in and you could not get out. It was as if the country was surrounded by an invisible wall sealed by rumors and guarded by militia. And inside that fishbowl, 800,000 people were killed in less than 2 months. And outside that fishbowl, the world watched on as if mesmerized by the horror unfolding on our television sets. And countries with the capacity to act withdrew the last remaining protection forces from Rwanda. They left the people at the mercy of those bloodthirsty mobs. They made humanitarian assistance incredibly dangerous and incredibly difficult. Those countries made a choice. They also sent a clear message. They sent a message: we won't help. Humanity and solidarity were laid to waste in those dark days. But there were some people who made another choice. There were Rwandans who bravely tried to protect their persecuted friends and neighbors by sheltering them, by covering for them. There were my own colleagues who treated the injured, trying to protect patients and staff. They risked their lives to be alongside the hunted. And while they could not end the carnage, they could provide islands of humanity in a sea of atrocity. Syria and Yemen, South Sudan and Somalia, Central African Republic and Myanmar. Millions and millions of people today are living in fishbowls of violence. They're attacked, they're bombed, they're gassed, they're starved, they're abandoned. People suffer cruelly, and the world watches on. And we say, it's terribly sad, but there's nothing that I can do. But there is something that we can do. In a world where there's unbearable chaos and suffering, there are things that we can do. We need to reach out in these moments. We can do things to help people. I've seen it myself. I've seen the pain and suffering of the genocide. I've seen the pain and suffering of people forced to leave their homes. I've seen that we can do something. Earlier this year, I traveled to southern Mexico, where I met Doris. Doris and her daughter had fled certain death at the hands of gangs in El Salvador. They'd come to Mexico seeking sanctuary. But when they got to Mexico, that was not what they received. Instead, they were kidnapped, held up for ransom, and raped. The authorities knew who the perpetrators were, but they chose to do nothing. People travel thousands and thousands of kilometers across the desert trying to seek sanctuary in Europe. When they reach Libya, they're treated as criminals. They're thrown into detention centers where they're beaten, tortured, humiliated. Europe knows what's going on inside Libya, but still they seal their borders. and they send those people that they should be protecting back to those cells of despair. After the Second World War, we promised that we would take care of people who are fleeing persecution and violence. We vowed never again to turn our backs on human suffering, yet here we are. It's as if there's two worlds looking through this invisible wall, looking at each other, one world with everything to give, and the other with nothing to lose. You know, there's a real human cost, a real human consequence to this dispassionate detachment. This rejection of people who are coming to us asking for help also has profound consequences on our society. When we reject people, we feed the extremism, we feed the social imbalance, and we feed existing conflicts, and we will feed new conflicts. As citizens, we're so often fed a politics of fear, a fear that we too often lap up. Some of our politicians, some of our media, some of our leaders tell us that these migrants are coming to steal our jobs, that they're coming to bring terrorism to our shores. They tell us that plucking a drowning child from the Mediterranean Sea is akin to human smuggling. They tell us that looking after Doris and her daughter is human trafficking. Instead of questioning our prejudices, we stay inside our fishbowl, unable to touch, unable to feel, and unable to understand the suffering of our fellow human beings. We fall into apathy. But we have another choice. I've seen the pain and the suffering, but I've also seen that when we choose to act, we can make a difference. Do you remember Siberut? Well, Tanaz and Osoa Siberut went on to garner international support for the island. The illegal logging was stopped. The forced migration was stopped. An unlikely alliance, an unlikely liaison between a medicine man and a young tourist. But the humanity and solidarity that Tanaz inspired that day brought real change. And as citizens, we have to make a choice. We have to choose to do something instead of nothing. And people are doing just that today. There are grandmothers who are providing hot meals for people who survived the perilous journey across the Mediterranean Sea. There are people working in humanitarian and civil society organizations. There are students suspending their studies to go and help in refugee and migrant centers. There are families privately sponsoring refugees to come to their country. The list goes on. But despite these examples, we have to ask ourselves, have we contributed to this collective failure to care? Have we contributed to this collective failure to stand up for our fellow human beings? Have we collectively failed to stand up for the moral, political, and legal commitments we made after the Second World War? Have we as individuals been sitting by too long, waiting for somebody else, some government, some organization, some other to act? So what can we do as individuals? We can make choices. We can choose to refuse the politics of fear. We can choose to reject fake news and alternative facts. We can choose to stand up for our fellow citizens. We can choose to stand up for those moral commitments. We can choose to hold our states accountable. We can choose a narrative of humanity and solidarity instead of indifference and division. We can make choices. And in making those choices, we can break down those fishbowls. We can start to feel and touch and understand what our fellow human beings are going through. We can start then to build the societies that we want and need. Societies that are harmonious, compassionate, peaceful. we can start to build a powerful bridge to a new narrative of a shared humanity and solidarity. This narrative, this positive narrative, is a narrative that we desperately need today, a narrative that we desperately need to reset and to heal this young century. We have the choice, we have the power of choice, and it's our choice to make. Thank you.